Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the PRovoke webinar, which we are doing in partnership with the Bulleit Group. So today we are here to talk about something that's been on people's minds a lot lately, and that's trust. Specifically, how do you build trust and during a global pandemic? And in particular, with the role that PR and strategic communications can play in doing that. So we have leaders from two really innovative companies that have stepped up during this crisis, Carbon and Flexport, and we have leaders from both of those organizations that will talk about their experiences and provide some best practices. Just to let everyone know about sort of the format for today's webinar, we'll have a conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we will open things up for Q&A for the last 15 minutes. So please start inputting your questions throughout the discussion, and we look forward to kind of having you all interact. So we'll start. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction of our panelists, and I'm going to let them actually talk a little bit about what their organizations have done during this crisis. So from the 3D printing company Carbon, we have their CMO, Dara Treseder. So Carbon, I know, has used its technology to produce face shields and nasal swab tests. Dara, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here today with you all. Like Aarti said, I'm Dara Treseder. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Carbon. And essentially, one of the, Carbon is a 3D printing company, for those of you that are not as familiar with us. And once the pandemic hit, and we started to see supply chains getting disrupted almost immediately. But the supply chain that was most affected was our medical supply chain, right? We started to see a shortage and hear about it, and it was written about frequently in the press, shortage for personal protective equipment and shortage when it came to testing. And so we immediately started to think about how can we step in to fill that gap. So we mobilize our global network of customers and partners, because one of the things that 3D printing technology allows, and specifically our platform enables, is local for local production. So the ability to manufacture end products as and at when it's needed, where it's needed. And so this was an opportunity for us to actually start to live out our mission, which is helping the design and the delivery of products that the world really needs. And so we were able to get all of that up and running. And now we've produced, together with our network of customers and partners, we've produced over 270,000 face shields that have been used all over the world, from Netherlands to New York City. And we also stood up the production of 3D printed swabs validated by the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, which is associated with Harvard Medical School. And one of our production network partners was able to get that up and running, scaling up to 1 million swabs a week. So these are two concrete ways that we've helped, right? Providing face shields to help protect healthcare workers and first responders, and then increasing the testing capacity for COVID-19.
I went on mute there. I did the, so from Flexport, which is a shipping logistics company, we have their head of corporate communications, Raman. So Flexport, I know, has delivered about 62 million pieces of personal protective equipment during this crisis. Raman, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, and I'm really excited to be here. So my name is Raman Deol. I run corporate communications at Flexport, and Flexport is a global shipping platform. We move goods for almost 10,000 customers and suppliers. So the way we're sort of approaching this is twofold. In one bucket, we are sort of keeping goods moving even amidst COVID-related shutdowns. And there's a ton of implications there. Folks who have worked in the supply chain their entire life have, never dealt with anything like this. So sort of helping people navigate and keeping the flow of goods moving. And obviously, one of those sets of goods that's top of mind for everybody globally is how can we get medical gear to frontline responders. So since January 2020, a new updated number, we've shipped over 100 million units of medical equipment to different countries around the world. And about 10% of those were paid for by the Flexport.org fund. And so, very similar to Carbon, is sort of a lot of it was sort of reaching out to our networks very early on. We were able to secure space with folks like United Airlines and Atlas Air to make sure sort of the flow of these goods could keep moving. And it's sort of an unprecedented event, but pretty interesting few months on seeing how we were able to mobilize there.
Yeah. And of course, we also have Kyle Arteaga, who's co-founder and CEO of the Bulleit Group, which is a technology public relations consultancy. Kyle, do you want to just say a couple of words about kind of what you're seeing from your portfolio companies?
Sure. So we're first off, we're focused on bringing sci-fi to life, which is a very specific niche. Anything that lived in a sci-fi book or video in the past that's now becoming realistic is where we focus our client base includes Flexport. We've worked with Flexport for the past 6 years. And what I say is that everyone's struggling with communications. First off, they're trying to figure out internal comms, which often was the stepchild of communications. People hadn't really built that out very extensively, but now you're seeing it's the foremost importance for every single company. And everyone's trying to understand if it even makes sense to be pitching right now. Should I be doing communications? And what I like about this panel is these are two companies that aren't even asking that question. What they're saying is, we're going to do something that's impactful. And if there's residual media that comes as a result of that, that's great. And I really like that strategy. And that's what we're trying to tell companies is focus on what you can do, worry about the PR later.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what we're starting to see.
Yeah, and many of the points that you just raised, Kyle, we're going to be talking about throughout this discussion. And we've touched on this, but it would be great to kind of zoom out a little bit and get a sense from all of you, kind of what have been your communications priorities for the last and marketing, because Dara, I know you bring that perspective as well. What have been your priorities for the last couple of weeks, and is that changing now? I mean, are you looking to start balancing more of kind of the COVID news with other aspects of your business?
So I'm happy to kind of get started on this one. So I think for us, like Kyle said, the first and foremost, most important thing was internal communications, right? Really figuring out, and when I say internal communications, I mean internal within our organization, but also within our community. Like really figuring out, okay, once the pandemic hit, it was like, okay, what do we need to do to help? How can we help? How can we show up in a way that's authentic to us? And then how do we mobilize our employees and our partners and our customers to be able to do the work that's needed? And also keeping communication abreast, like making sure people are aware of how to work well remotely in a completely remote environment, right? There's the reality of that. Making sure that people are aware of the extreme measures we're taking around well-being, health, and safety of the folks that are actually the essential workers that are producing the face shields. And so for us, it was really getting internal communications up and running, like developing a strategy and then communicating that strategy to the relevant folks. And then we started to get inbounds, right, about the work that we were doing. And then so our approach was like, okay, when we get inbounds, we will respond and share what we're doing. And that was really our approach. The approach that we took. And I think that was the right one, because at the end of the day, when people reached out to us, we were glad to get the word out there, because it actually helped us mobilize more of our community. When people started to read about it, they were like, hey, how can we get involved? How can we donate more face shields? And some of our customers and partners started to spool up communities, people within their local communities to step up and help. So for us, the reason we started to, when we were sharing information, it was always with the end goal of continuing to further the mission, right? Continuing to make sure that we're showing up in the right way. And I think that has really served us well. So I think really getting, figuring out your strategy, number one, communicating those strategy to your internal stakeholders, and then being prepared, right, to talk about that if and when interest arises.
Mm-hmm. Raman, how was your, what would have been your priorities for the last couple of weeks? And
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar. I think what's interesting about sort of from a marketing and external comms perspective is that what we focus on Flexport sort of throughout the entire last year hasn't changed at all. And that is, how do we sort of showcase to the world that digital and flexible freight solutions are what you need in order to navigate your supply chains during times of uncertainty and turmoil and constantly changing markets. There has never been a moment in history, I think, like within our lifetimes, where that has been put to the test as now. So one channel is just sort of continuing to show how we're able to use our technology to help customers adapt. And then I think the second part of that is how do we use our data? Sort of Flexport from the operations has the largest private data set on global trade. So how do we use insights from that data and sort of from our expertise to help educate our customers? I think what has really changed is the incoming interest in supply chains, which has gone from relatively null from sort of a consumer perspective to very top of mind. So I think in that regard, we dealt with similar challenges where sort of the Frontline Responders Fund that Flexport.org started had a lot of big name donors to start with and started receiving a ton of incoming interest. And then it was a matter of taking a step back, realizing we only have so many spokespeople, we only have so much bandwidth. How do we really capitalize on the right opportunities to reach the right amount of people while also keeping sort of our donors, our customers up to date with, you know, what information is relevant to them. And I think, aside from the media engagement side, on the marketing side, we started a COVID resources page that sort of has weekly updates on what our customers and sort of just interested in parties in general need to know about how trade lanes are being impacted. We started a webinar series that's been extremely successful. And I think what we're seeing now is more so than ever, it's just an uncertain time and people are looking for information wherever they can get it. So if you're in a position to share that, it's sort of more well received than ever before right now.
No, Raman, when you're talking about sort of your, you know, the priorities haven't shifted that much in the last year. You know, I was thinking about the fact that, you know, both Flexport and Carbon are both sort of considered to be unicorns, you know, with billion-dollar valuations. The New York Times headline today, I don't know if you all saw, right? I mean, unemployment today is 14.7%. This is the highest since the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. So in this environment, like how, I mean, is being a unicorn, like what does that even mean? Like how are the media even talking about it? Are they still talking, like asking you about your valuations and things like that?
So yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. I think what we've seen is that I think a lot of tech companies, their theses are being put to the test in a very absolute way right now. As a technology company, basically what we're promising or what we're saying, our hypothesis is that through technology, we can make your lives easier when you're trying to ship goods. So I think now if you are a tech company and you're sort of delivering in that arena, I think what the media and the general appetite's interest is are you delivering on your promise? And so I think in that sense, a little bit of the focus has been taken away from sort of the company, how the company is being built and like how much money you're raising and how are you delivering on this for your customers. So I'll say in that sense, that's been a pretty big shift in sort of the incoming interest we've received.
Yeah, and the only thing I would just add to that is, you know, I think I've always found the news around funding and valuation to not be as important, right, about the news about impact and what you're doing for society, what you're doing for the world. And I think what we're seeing is that the conversation is shifting. So reporters are no longer kind of, you know, focusing on like the, you know, that really interesting founder that's doing really crazy out there stuff and the valuation that the company has received, but they're really focusing on substance, right? They're asking hard questions. They're focusing on how are you fulfilling your promise? And I think that's been something that we as a community, right, I think specifically in the startup community, we've had to really reckon with, I would say over sort of the past 12 to 18 months has been, and obviously with COVID, it's really ramped up. But it's really been a time of, you know, if you put a promise out there, you have to fulfill that promise and you have to live up to that promise. And if you're not able to live up to that promise, you have to be clear that this is an aspiration and that you are on your way, being very open and vulnerable. And I think that that's really been the approach that we've been taking at Carbon. And I think it's served us well. So I think if you're a startup, I think really trying to make sure that you're not focusing on just hype, but you're really focusing on authenticity, you're focusing on impact, you're clear about aspirations, you're clear about shortcomings. I think that that's really more the appetite that, you know, in terms of what reporters are looking for. They're really looking for communicators, spokespeople that are not tone deaf, but understand the needs of the moment and can clearly articulate how their companies are rising up to the challenge.
So, what I'm hearing from all of you is, that people really do want information right now. And I'm curious, because I'm sure many of the viewers who are listening in right now are curious about, what's the balancing act between sort of participating in this narrative and the risk of seeming opportunistic, especially if you don't necessarily have a story that lends itself as well as kind of both Flexport and Carbon do. So I know this is sort of do you have any advice for some of the folks?
I'll take first.
All right, I'll go for it.
We definitely have some clients that don't have a COVID focused story. There's quite a few of them, in fact. And what we've said is look, your need to communicate still exists. However, reset your expectations. As Dara was saying earlier, don't expect that the media is going to pay attention to you, even if they were your beat reporter for 10 years and they've always covered you, and no matter what, they've always cared. They may still care, but that doesn't mean it gets to print. So, use this time to build out your content asset. Use this time to reconsider your executive platforms. Maybe the way that you were positioning a certain executive isn't right. Maybe there's new executives, like the people responsible for your supply chains, that actually should be taking more prominent view in the public eye. Perhaps it's that one person that's in finance who's done some great community impact work, who should be your spokesperson for the next few weeks if you have a reticent CEO. So just think through all of those types of things. But again, reset expectations. The goal here is to show survival and then business resilience. It is not necessarily to get a bunch of inbound press, unless you have the right story.
Sorry, Dara, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think Kylie's absolutely right. I think that the key question here is, how are you positioning your company to emerge stronger? And I think you really have to go to that as the North Star, right? Again, it's not about the number of articles you get. It's not about the press. It's about positioning the company to emerge stronger. And I think really taking that as the North Star, whether or not you have a COVID-19 related story, I think you can start to think about, okay, what are the key things that we need to be communicating? How do we need to show up to our key stakeholders? What are the things that are of interest to them? And I think having that North Star of how do I position my company to thrive and emerge from this stronger is a great way to really center the communications and the strategic marketing efforts that you're working on as a startup, or even as a larger company. I think it's important for all companies to think that way.
Kyle, to the point you made about rethinking who from your executive leadership is going to be your spokesperson right now. I'm curious if and anyone can answer this. Whether, how you've thought about executive communications right now, who are you putting forth? What are your CEOs or, other members of your executive team saying that maybe is different? I know we've addressed this to some degree, but if there's anything else that you all want to add about how you're thinking about executive communications.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. I think one big learning lesson for us is sort of when the influx of incoming media opportunities came in, we sort of wanted to be helpful and provide as much insight as possible. And what happened sort of throughout the process is toning that down and realizing where can we truly be subject matter experts? Where are we adding value that you can't find other places? So for example, with the shipping of PPE, a lot of people want to talk about procurement of PPE, and that is not that's not our expertise. We have people that can sort of speak to it, but realizing that, hey, you can still be helpful to media and you can still maintain those relationships by maybe connecting them with your partners who are better spokespeople for this, and then reserving sort of your spokespeople and expanding your spokesperson bench to folks that have more niche sort of specialties has been really key for us in sort of keeping a more strategic stream of momentum going.
Raman, I wanted to follow up because, your CEO and founder, Ryan Peterson, has been kind of quite high profile in the tech sector. And one of the things he had said, I think this was last year, is how he likes to think of business more as like a biological system. I think his quote was, this is again from 2019, we want our company to behave like an immune system where people see a problem and kill it rather than waiting for permission. And I'm wondering how that philosophy's played out in a moment of crisis.
Yeah, so I think you can see it sort of across the company. I think especially with how visible Flexport.org and sort of the medical equipment and being able to help in sort of those supply chains has been, it has really been, I think, sort of setting that cultural expectation. What that's done for the company is allow everybody to feel like they are part of the solution. So it's sort of one team that's managing it, but like the executives since the beginning have made it very clear that it is the Flexport technology that drives these solutions, and every single person here is responsible for either building the technology, selling the technology, positioning the technology, and it's been a lot of all hands on deck. And you can see that pride almost, it's visceral in the company. When you post anything about .org or sort of Susie, who's the head of .org, people are engaging with that sort of content on Slack more than anything else. And I think it's making people proud and it's keeping morale really high right now, which has been key for us.
And the only thing I would just add to the comments when we talk specifically about executives is the need to make sure that executives are showing up internally. So I think that actually, you know, one of the things that we've started to do is we have a monthly thing we call Carbon Connect. So every week we have a weekly all hands on Fridays, but every month we have a Carbon Connect. And when we have the Carbon Connect, our entire executive team is there to answer questions. And we don't reposition the questions. We ask the questions exactly as they're submitted. So it's actually funny because sometimes the questions, I mean, these are tough questions, right? These are tough times. And I think hearing from the entire executive team and getting to know not just what the CEO thinks and the CFO thinks, but getting to know the broader executive group has actually been really great for us because it's starting to help us really build, deepen our community. It's starting to help people be excited, not just about the things that they read in media or the things that are front and center, but some of the other issues that are going on, right? Like I think about last week, we had our people team really focus on our return to office plan, what that looks like, even though we're still in shelter in place. They started to share what that would look like, and an enormous amount of work, right, is going into this. And so it gave people a different insight into that. Or, you know, so I just think that really making sure when you think about executive communications, you're not just thinking about the external front, but you're thinking also about the internal front, I think is really important during times of crisis, especially like this.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, it's like, you know, think about how your leadership is communicating internally as well as externally. So, you know, speaking of CEOs, and I always like to ask this question, and that's, you know, how does your CEO evaluate your functions, and has that changed at all during this crisis?
So, I mean, I'm the CMO, so I have all of marketing, I have all of communications, and I have all of inside sales. So I'm sort of evaluated, you know, across those three different things, right? Really making sure that we're building pipeline, we're driving growth for the business. Obviously, this is a unique year. And so really thinking about how are we strategically positioning ourselves as a company? Like what are the implications of COVID-19 on our business and how are we responding? So, you know, she's really asking a lot of hard questions about that. We're going through reviews about that. You know, I pivoted some of it, we have, you know, going to physical events and trade shows, and we were actually going to do a conference this year. So physical events was a part of our 2020 strategy, and we had to shift, right, at a moment's notice to have it all be digital. And so I've been sharing with her what are the new KPIs when we look at it from a digital perspective, and really having a discussion there. And I think one of the things that's been interesting is obviously in the middle of a pandemic, even if you have resources, right, if something is not urgent, important and urgent, companies are sort of being like, I will get to this when I can, but right now I need to focus on what's in front of me. So I think really thinking about your funnel in a more, I think a longer term way, not just about what's converting right now, right here, because people are still distracted. Some companies don't know when people are gonna, like, you know, here in California, we're still in shelter in place. So, but I think thinking about, okay, how are we nurturing and continuing to develop relationships with our customers and our prospects, right? How are we deepening those relationships? Thinking and KPIs along those lines are things that we can show now, even as the world is a little bit distracted right now. So I think really thinking about your KPIs, not just kind of at the bottom of the funnel, but really thinking about it at the top of the funnel, at the middle of the funnel, especially during times of crisis, you know, is really important. And so for us, that's how I've been thinking about it for marketing, for communications, and for inside sales.
Yeah, I think to add to that, which is it's all great. Sort of our executive team is very analytical, right? So if you give them numbers, they are quantitative. If you give them numbers and sort of, well, for example, with external comms, it's sort of share of voice. Is your coverage increasing year over year? How many briefings are we setting up? And I think message pull through. And for internal comms, similarly, it's sort of a culture amp survey. So it's like, how is this messaging resonating with people? Are people feeling empowered to work hard, but not feeling burnt out? So those are sort of the metrics that have been used historically. I would say now more so than ever, the execs are also humans. I think hearing sort of anecdotal feedback from customers who have found something helpful, almost like one story goes far beyond any sort of comprehensive metric right now. And we're sort of seeing that in the feedback that's coming in to us. And it's been interesting to see more of that qualitative feedback really taking precedence right now.
I think just to jump on that, I think two things that I started doing when I joined Carbon as CMO, I instituted, is every week we send out a press monitor. And that kind of goes through quantitative KPIs, qualitative KPIs, as well as like top of mind for what's going on that week. And we also send out a marketing monitor. So we kind of making sure that all the KPIs are there, they're the same. Every week you can see how it's changing week over week, and we have commentary. And I think just the point I want to make here is transparency is so important. Transparency and consistency. Because if you're consistent about the KPIs that you're looking at, it's easy to explain what's changing. And if you're transparent and you're always sharing that information, people don't have to wake up and say, I wonder what our PR team's doing. What have they done for us lately? Should we cut that budget? Are we really getting the ROI out of that? Because you're proactively communicating. And one thing I always say is marketers don't market themselves. And I think it's the same thing is true for communicators. It's so important that we communicate and we market what we're doing and we help people understand, right? I think whether it's using storytelling, it's obviously making sure we're data driven. We have our numbers, we stick to it. We show how it's changing over time and providing insights, right? From what we're hearing from reporters, what we're seeing in the market. So I think just having, standard reports, especially during these times where everybody is remote, is going to be critical for companies moving forward.
I want to take a moment just to remind the audience that you all can type in your questions. We've gotten a couple, and we'll transition to that in just a moment. But Dara, you were talking about PR budgets and even PR teams and what the expectations are, not only from executives. And I'm curious to hear from all of you. What are your expectations for your external partners right now? What do you what's the ideal role a PR agency can play during a crisis like this? And even sort of beyond that, I'm just curious to see what do you look for in your agency partners?
Yeah, I think right now for us, top of mind is more so than ever being in-house at a company that is working on sort of anything COVID related. You start to, you're really drinking your own Kool-Aid, right? So you're really thinking about your story. You're really looking at the world from your perspective. It's sort of this unique experience where I think, along with everything else we've said about internal communications, where executives are showing up in a much more personal way, they're being much more vulnerable and sort of like voicing they're also, worried. This is unprecedented for them. For example, we have sort of executives showing up on our all hands with their kids or making videos about their life at home. So you have an idea of how they're living. What's important when you're sort of living in that world is for your agency to sort of level set for you. It's like, okay, this is very important for you. This is what's very important for the rest of the world. And I think expectation setting is a big one. I think we're going to get used to maybe a world in which we've gone a certain level of coverage, and that will change at some point. So being very proactive and thinking about, once this wave of coverage is over, what are the stories that are going to be top of mind next? So for example, Western Digital had a article come out in Wall Street Journal, I believe last month. And the premise was how their CEO started thinking about COVID in January and how the company has been able to adapt since then. To me, I would have not thought that those articles were going to start coming out in March, April, that early. So how can you as our agency sort of position the world for us as okay, in 3 months, this is going to be interesting, and sort of give us your best guess, bring us creative ideas. And then just keeping the train running, which, big shout out to our Bulleit team, does a lot of that for us. And also, speaking of reporting, they pull a huge monthly report that spans global comms, is very, very comprehensive. And that has been immeasurably helpful for our team in explaining what we do, not only strategically, but sort of what the fruits of that labor is.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is really three things. I think one, the agency can really help with benchmarking. So understanding, how are you showing up versus others, right? And not just your direct competitors, but right now it's a very cluttered, right? Very noisy time. So I think they can really, really help you with benchmarking, understanding how to set expectations, manage expectations internally. And I think that's a really important role. The second thing is really, I have one of my ways of working is debate, decide, commit. So we debate, we make a decision, and we commit. And I think your agency can be a great accountability partner. It's like, I almost wish I have them help me with my fitness right now. But it's kind of like that accountability partner that's like, whoa, we had a debate. We made this decision that we're not going to proactively do this. We're going to commit. I don't care what this person said to you. I don't care that board member sent you like 7 CNBC videos of other people doing that. We made this as a decision. We debated it. We made a decision, and we're going to commit. And I think really helping you through that process of debate, decide, and commit, I think is a really, really important role, because like Raman said, we are drinking our own Kool-Aid, right? We're living it every day, right? And I think having an accountability partner is really important. And then the third thing I would say that I think the agency can do still, and it's one of the reasons why I believe in the power of agency, and I think, having an internal team and an agency is really the best success for complete holistic communications, is in bringing in some creativity, right? Right now, we're all kind of going through, this is just trying, right? Personally, it's trying. I mean, I have my 4-year-old and 2-year-old downstairs. I'm like, texting my husband, please make sure they don't scream and run upstairs. Like, we're all kind of dealing with this like merging of like work and life. And it's a stressful time. Some of us are dealing with pain, and we're dealing with loss, and we're dealing with some of our communities being disproportionately affected. So this is just a really hard, stressful time. And that means it's harder to just come up with creative ideas. But the thing that the agency can do is, because they see what's happening across a broad array of customers, they can start to help with cross-pollination. They can help us kind of get a little bit out of our rut, see the bigger picture, be inspired by new ideas. And so even facilitating things like, a small get-together for chief marketing officers and chief communications officers, like just to talk in an intimate, off-the-record setting about how we're thinking about things, I think that's a powerful role that agencies are playing, and I think will continue to play as we navigate this crisis.
DDC, just debate, decide, commit. That's great. So I had more questions that I can get to, but I wanted to kind of give our audience a chance to engage. So one question I have is about sort of this idea of good washing, and I'll just read it. I'll just read it directly. Can you speak more specifically to how you've broached proactive outreach to media and customers to share your organization's good work or your COVID point of view? Understandably, many reporters are extra sensitive to pitches right now, and of course, the public is skeptical of good washing. So I'm curious to see here how you all have kind of handled any outbound media engagements.
So I think for us, our approach was always, if people ask about this, if they proactively come to us about this, then we know that this is we'll respond to them. And if there's another reporter who covers a similar beat that's a friendly that we've been interacting with, we might let them know as, hey, FYI, this is going on. So really our outbound strategy was very anchored in, what do people want to hear right now? So as opposed to like us just pushing, like there were things that we wanted to talk about, but nobody was asking about them. And so in the spirit of debate, decide, commit, when we had decided that this is the way our strategy is going to be, we had to hold firm, even though sometimes internally people were like, but this is really exciting. And we were like, not really. No one's asking about this. No one's interested in this. And so I think that, in terms of having your proactive strategy be really anchored in, what's important and top of mind, right, for the community, your community right now, the questions that reporters are asking about, where they're digging into, I think really having that be kind of a guiding light or guiding framework for how you do outbound has been really helpful for us.
I think one thing too, to add on to what Dara said, is this is proven to us the importance of owned channels. If you didn't have owned channels before, an empty pitch just is going to get lost and probably look as good washing. And so this is where the fact that Carbon and Flexport already had blogs, already had a sizable social presence, already had some form of a name, helped them significantly. If you're an unknown company, now's not the time to start.
I couldn't agree more, Kyle.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we didn't mention earlier, but we did when we were talking in advance of this call, is we're going to see a complete shift as to the leaders in tech after all of this. I mean, the Googles, the Facebooks, they'll always exist. And you could argue that, you know, social media is finally social again, which is great news. But that next level, the Ubers and the Lyfts are seeing challenges that they've never seen before. And I think there's an opportunity now for companies who are grounded in things like supply chains where people care about to take their place in a very authentic way as a result of this pandemic.
So one other question we have, it's a two-part question, and the first part we actually already answered at the beginning of this webinar. And just to let everyone in the audience know, if you did sign in a little late, we will have the full audio, the whole audio and visual file that we'll be tweeting out, and it will be on the PRovoke Media site as well. So we're not going to answer the first part of the question, which was what advice do you have for businesses that are not directly involved in COVID as they go about their outreach. But the second part of the question is interesting as well. Can you comment on the new buzzword, new normal? A journalist friend of mine doesn't like that word, but isn't that how things will really become after the peak of the pandemic and when reopening begins? And I'm curious because that's actually come up in a few conversations of mine where people have they get really bristly at that term. And I was talking to somebody like last week that was like, they prefer the term next normal because what's normal is continuing to evolve. And I'm curious, if you all, in both the way you communicate internally and externally, what you think of that term new normal.
So we don't use that term specifically. I think the new normal is just implied in the fact that some things are going to change forever. And I think that's what we try to really drive home in sort of whether it's media or sort of internal engagement is, I think what is the new normal, if you will, is that for currently there is going to be some uncertainty. And at some point that uncertainty is just going to turn into how we operate. For Flexport, we try to explain externally is this is the point of sort of no return on you cannot operate a supply chain without a technology solution anymore. So to us, that has always been the normal for us. And now sort of what we're seeing is that other people are sort of coming aboard to that. But yeah, I think maybe not using the term, but just implying it through your communications that this is what is happening now. So it is the new normal, I guess, for lack of a better term.
And I think,
yeah.
Go ahead, Dara.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I don't think you need to get hung up on a specific term, but I think what's interesting about this is how are you, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, my AirPods slipped out there. But I think what's interesting about this is how are you navigating uncertainty? And how are you navigating the different phases of that? And it's going to evolve, right? And I think just the fact that we are navigating uncharted terrain and things are changing and will continue to change. And there are things that we haven't even anticipated that are going to happen. And just being okay with that ambiguity and how to navigate that, I think is important. And I would just kind of speak more to it that way, because I think everyone identifies with that, right? Versus kind of calling it a new normal. Because I know there are people who are nostalgic and, be like, I don't want things to change. And people that are like, oh, what does this mean? And so I think just kind of, we don't use that terminology. We just talk about how we're navigating the season that we're in.
So we have several more questions actually to go. And I wonder if now we should do a bit of a lightning kind of session where, you only respond if you feel like you have something to say, so we can kind of get through the rest of these. This next question comes from, I guess I haven't said anyone's name yet, so I won't say it now, from an attendee who says, I love how Dara provided examples about how you show the value of marketing comms and inside sales during times of layoffs. And obviously marketing is often one of the first to go. Diving into her comment about standard reports, what data points has she been able to point to that she thinks shows her organization's the greatest value?
So that's a really good question. I think, for us, every company is going through a different time because we were able to step up in a really major way during COVID-19, right? We actually we were able to we saw an increase in interest When you think about everything from the top of the funnel, website traffic, our social media engagement increased by 50%, right? All, our share of voice increased, all of our top of the funnel metrics, our leads numbers increased, our MQLs increased, all the top of the funnel metrics were increasing. But the challenge we started to see was in that kind of middle to bottom of the funnel. So it was like people were like, oh, this is really interesting. Let me bookmark this and save this. And people are also learning a lot more. So we're seeing a lot more engagement in our virtual events, a lot more consumption of our content. In fact, we've ramped that up. And so I've been able to talk to that. But then at the same time, if I'm just keeping it 100% real, right, there's a challenge on the conversion side. And so, and that's because people are distracted. People don't know if they're going to even have their own jobs, and people are being asked to relook at their budget, so they don't want to make commitments. And so being able to understand, and we were able to also drive data and insights from the content to say, okay, these are the questions people are asking. This is how people are thinking. And then being able to frame that for our audience, I think has been really helpful. So I would say, look at your metrics, top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel, be able to understand the nuances of what's going on, what's different, and be able to provide commentary that can kind of help people understand why, certain metrics are outperforming, but others aren't. So that's kind of been how we've approached that. Looking at everything from website visits, leads that we're generating, all the way to move stages through our Salesforce funnel, and then even into conversion into becoming a customer or expanding as an existing customer.
Well, just to add really quickly to that, one of the things that struck me about Carbon is that you forged closer relationships with a lot of your partners and customers as a result of all of this. And to me, if I was a CEO, I would say, wow, like that's impressive.
I mean, yes, it's been amazing, from big customers like Adidas, right, to our injection molding shops in the middle of the country, and it's been amazing, I think, for us. So that's again what we're seeing is there's some of our customers that may otherwise not have been doing anything are having resilience because they're able to help others modernize supply chains. They're able to step up and help. So those are the types of metrics that we're able to point to, even as obviously we deal with the challenge that there are still customers who are distracted during this time.
And if anyone who's tuning in isn't familiar with what Carbon has done with Adidas, I recommend just Googling Carbon Adidas, and there's several news stories that you'll see come up, which is really fantastic. The next question I think is really interesting because it's about the international community. And I know we've had a really US-centric, not only US-centric, we've had somewhat of a California-centric perspective on this call. I think we're all not only in California, we're all in the San Francisco area. And the question is, how do you work with the international community right now during these disruptive times, especially as we've seen, each country is handling this pandemic differently. And not only, at the city level, it seems to vary as well. So I'm curious, how that's worked, or at least I'm curious also, but so was our viewer who's asked the question.
Yeah, for sure. I think, for Flexport, we're sort of always inherently been global since it's a global supply chain. So we have offices in Asia and offices in EU. And I will say one huge learning lesson for us at the beginning of this year was to be very we started very US centric and then quickly realized some of our solutions are not applicable to other countries. People are going through different experiences. This culturally is very different depending on if you're in a city or if you're in a rural area, if you're working in manufacturing or if you're in a warehouse. So what that really required on our end is sort of setting up more routine global syncs and learning basically putting out sort of this general narrative of what we're working on, and then really having our global partners go in and sort of challenge us where things weren't applicable to them. And then when it comes to reporting, a big thing that we do is a large monthly external communications report that goes to all the executives. And for example, this last month we had that, typically we'll send that from the US comms folks, and last month we had it come from our EU marketing lead, and that made a huge difference. It was a completely different perspective. They're working on very different partnerships out there with companies. For example, we're working with United Airlines, globally, but for our European counterparts, there's a very impressive partnership that they have sort of with KLM Airlines, and so to give them the opportunity to sort of speak to that. But yeah, so honestly for us, it's been a lot more internal assurance that our storylines match up, and that where they don't, we are pointing that out and showing the differences and wins across the different offices.
Dara, did you want to comment at all on the global perspective?
Yeah, I think, you know, we're also a global company. And the only thing that I would just add to that is we're actually learning from other countries, right? I think, you know, in China, obviously experienced the first wave of this. And so we started to see, even before kind of the US government and the CDC were saying wear masks, our Chinese employees were saying, hey, people should be wearing masks. So we were thinking about this, like, it's almost like our policy was enhanced and even ahead of the curve, because we were able to draw on learnings from different cultures, from different countries. And you know, I just think that it's so, what's happening is so unique, and everybody experiences it in such a unique way. And so having a global footprint, I actually think allows us to be more empathetic. It allows us to learn. And I think it allows us to adapt more as a company than if we were just in the US, because we're starting to think about things in a much more holistic way, in a much more inclusive way. And I actually think it's making our response overall better as a company.
Well, and I would also, it's probably going to get even more disparate, right? So you see New Zealand has opened up everything up again. Jacinda Ardern did a phenomenal job closing the country up, and they're back up for business. Vietnam is apparently all, you know, has everything sorted and is ready to go. And so I think the messy part just started. The messy part is whole business right now doesn't look anything like anything that anyone has been prepared for. Yeah. And we're going to have to learn as we go.
Yeah.
And the border closures will be interesting, right? Because some countries are open, but open within, but closed from the external perspective. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that you know, affects globalization and the movement of goods and services around the world.
Well, and that's got to be that next round of stories, right? Like, does Vietnam all of a sudden become one of your massive partners because they opened up earlier?
Right.
Does this change trade routes? Does this change who we do business with?
So we have one, and we have time for one more audience question. And audience folks, sorry, I think we have to cut it off now. But this last question, which I think is good, it seems like neither Carbon or Flexport are dealing with this, but if you guys can provide some advice. So if you have an executive who's not media savvy and they're looking to just push forward with business as usual, they want the coverage, they want to go forward with product announcements. What advice would you give for folks that are dealing with those sort of, you know, situations inside of their organizations?
So, you know, every company I feel like has, you know, its version of this. I think that, you know, one of the things that, you know, the nice thing about it is, as a CMO, these are my peers, right? So it's a little bit of a different situation that I'm in. But one of the things that I think has been really helpful for us is the fact that, Kyle mentioned it earlier, you have owned channels. So sometimes I'm like, oh, that's great. We'll put that on our blog. That's wonderful. Sounds like that'd be a great tweet. And I send them the tweet, look at that, right? Word's out there. And so I think just really looking at your owned channels and figuring out how you utilize each channel. One other thing I was very clear from day one, I was like, we are not going to be that company that inundates our customers with emails, right? And then people start to filter out our emails because we're overwhelming them. And so figuring out your channels, like, okay, how do we communicate on Instagram? What do we do on Facebook? What are we doing on Twitter? What do we do on our blog? What do we do on our website? What do we do on email? And we actually have a strategy and a plan for all of our own channels. So we're able to reroute requests in. And what we're finding is people are actually feeling satisfied, because we will find a way to kind of communicate to people who want to hear that news, because there are some people that are, you know, interested in that specific thing and would be excited about it. But how do we communicate to them in the right way, right? Without kind of being tone deaf or spamming our audience and being not as thoughtful. So I think leveraging your own channels, having a strategy for all your own channels during this time, and having a really nice routing mechanism is how we're dealing with it as an organization.
Yeah, and I would say just one quick add to that. I think, at least from the pure external communications side, sometimes what you need to do with executives like this is a little bit painful, but send the pitch. If that's what it takes and you get the response that people aren't interested, and that is sort of sometimes the proof that that somebody needs to just see that you're trying and that you're proving your own thesis that this is not what is sort of interesting right now. And then I think there is a world in which we will have to just keep launching products and things will have to still keep going live. This will be our life now. And then just being able to set those expectations very clearly on that and this is what everybody is talking about right now. If we do not have some sort of tie into that, it will not be newsworthy at the moment.
So I want to close on sort of a forward-looking thought, and going back to what Kyle was saying at the beginning was that, you know, they sort of bring sci-fi to life. And as we've seen, so I'm sure folks are familiar, so Governor Cuomo is now sort of asking for kind of tech billionaires to help him rebuild and reimagine a post, you know, COVID New York. And of course, you know, many other companies have joined the Pandemic Action Network to help sort of, you know, prevent something like this from happening again in the future. So I'm curious, you know, how do you think technology will reshape the way we live? You know, what our cities look like even? And again, this is very much a futuristic question, but I'm just curious to get kind of some ideas around that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that, you know, what's going to happen when it comes to where goods and services are produced, there's going to be a lot more thought about that. Because I think for the first time, people are starting to, you know, it was like, oh, these were just movies, like Contagion or something. But people are starting to realize that I have to actually disaster-proof my supply chain. I have to modernize my supply chain. I have to make sure that I can produce, if I have to, at a moment's notice, produce something where it needs to be, I can do that. And I think you're going to see that happen more and more. The local for local production, the modernization of supply chain, and technology in that area, I think is going to become more important. The other thing that I think is just going to stay with us is the future of work, right? I think there's going to be an immense amount of innovation when it comes to things like this. Like, you know, are we going to be like holographic talking to each other? I don't know. But I think that there's going to be some real transformation in technology that allows us to connect, to communicate with each other, that allows us to work more remotely. And I do think you're going to see more companies kind of moving to a more distributed workforce, right? People are going to start to realize if productivity isn't going down as much, if my T&E costs are so low, but we're still able to get the same results, do I need all around the world? Do I need people actually coming into an office, or do I need to pay for that space? So I think how we work is going to change, and technology is going to be a big catalyst for that.
Yeah. I think how we work and also how we socialize and sort of do things that were normally only in-person things. For example, before sort of the shelter-in-place orders, we had a media networking event with our CEO and 2 other CEOs of digital freight companies. And the initial instinct was just, we'll cancel that. It wasn't really a news moment. It was more for networking. And then we ended up doing it digitally. And there was 36 tier 1 reporters that either joined or watched the recording afterwards. That is something pre-COVID I would never have recommended. I would have never done. Too many things can go wrong, and it ended up being very interesting. So I think sort of along those lines, it's important sort of as we move forward to remember to take risks. And if you were ever going to share sort of maybe more sensitive or vulnerable learning lessons as a business, like now is the time to do it. I think people are open and receptive to it, and we're going to hear a lot more of it. So it's a unique opportunity to sort of share your thoughts in a very honest way.
Kyle, I'm sure there's something you want to add here from what you're saying.
Yeah, the main thing I would just say is that people actually pay attention to infrastructure now. Mm-hmm. People want to hear how things are done. Like there's a great podcast, How I Built This. You know, there's going to be more of that. People want to understand simple things. Like, you know, one of my favorite stories recently was Zoom. Everyone's using Zoom. Even Zoom had trouble with remote work. Mm-hmm. You know, how is that possible? Slack has gone on a huge PR campaign to explain, like, hey, we know all about this, and yet we're still struggling. Let me tell you what we're learning as we go. We're all learning as we go. You know, even the best crisis plan didn't prepare for this. So think about those types of things. I think there was a really good tweet the other day from Aaron Levy that there was more digital transformation that took place in the last 2 months than there has in the last 2 years.
Wow. Yeah.
I think Satya Nadella said the same thing. So even simple things like, hey, we put everything in the cloud. Well, you probably should have already, but if you haven't, now you should. Have you looked at all the different places where you can get nasal swabs? Like, who would have thought we'd run out of that? Who would have thought you'd run out of Charmin or chicken? You know, so you know, the failure to think through how you might fail is probably the biggest issue that we all have. And so, again, I go back to social media. Build up your social channels. It's the best place to test out how someone might like a story. Before you pitch anything, see if anyone responds. If no one likes it, if no one comments on it, then clearly it shouldn't go anywhere else. And you know, that's the best A/B test you probably have.
And that's quite practical, actually, for folks that are listening can implement that right now. So I just got a couple more questions, but I think we're getting really close to the top of the hour, so we do need to wrap up. Thank you. I mean, obviously we went longer than we expected to. I mean, you all have been so fantastic. Thank you so much, Dara, Raman, and Kyle. You guys have been like fantastic. And I'm sure, you know, if folks have questions that they can put them in the comments of the article or ask them on social, and if people want to answer there, they can. And that's the other place where anyone who joined late or want to share this conversation with some of their colleagues, we'll have a recording of this discussion on PRovoke Media, on our YouTube channel, and then also on our site, and we'll also be pushing it out on social media. So look for it there. And in the meantime, everyone have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, Aarti, for you know, facilitating this, and Kyle and Raman. This was a great discussion. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for tuning in.
All right.
Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.